Sorry, I'm just a little bit behind. Almost ready to start. Is my audio okay for you guys? I've been messing with the settings today. Alright, let's go ahead and start. Hello. So, today we're going to work on adding associations to Diesel. Just get everything sized back up. So, associations are going to be a little tricky. Oh, actually, since people have been mentioning my compile times every time I've streamed, I'm like, it's not normally this bad. I've ordered a separate piece of hardware to deal with video encoding so that my compile times can be back down to their normal 10-15 second range and not, I think it's somewhere around a minute when I'm streaming. I was actually, before we started this, working on a patch for the Rust compiler, which takes like 10 minutes to compile normally. That would be interesting to do live. In that it would take 3 hours just to run the test suite once. Anyway, so associations. So by associations, I'm referring to things that help you load data from tables where you have a foreign key connecting them. So in Rails, you might have something like this. Oops. Right, and then down here you'd have article class. And so when you have a user, you can do, if you want to get its articles, just do .articles. If the articles haven't been loaded yet, it goes and loads them. And if they haven't been loaded, they're already there. And the query that this would execute is something along the lines of that. Now, there's a number of issues that I have with this, both in Ruby and then also in a similar-ish API that may exist in Rust. Now, the first issue that this has is it becomes possible or even easy to introduce what we usually refer to as an n+1 queries bug. So if you have more than one user, let's say you're looping through all users. This is now going to execute one query per user, and then the +1 is the query to get all of the users. Now in Rails, what you're supposed to do to avoid this is you're supposed to do dot includes articles. And that will eager load all of them. So that will execute two queries. The first one will be that, and then the second one would be right, and then we'd have a bind parameter for every ID, and it'll explicitly pass the ID of everything loaded because it goes through the same code path the code path that goes through is not aware that we loaded all users, and presumably all users links to all articles. So that's the first issue, is this sort of non-local ability to cause massive performance problems. This is part of why in Diesel I've avoided ever introducing a thread local connection. I'm actually surprised somebody hasn't already added written a little library that adds one to Diesel, but I'm sort of adamant that if you are going to execute a SQL query, you need to explicitly pass in a database connection, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Now, the second problem is you could call this an invasive association if you wanted to, and I'm getting that terminology from when you talk about things like linked lists in C. There's invasive versus non-invasive linked lists, and an invasive linked list is when the struct in the list has to be aware and is responsible for holding a reference to the next or previous node. So these are sort of invasive associations in that they become a property of the struct. So Ecto is an ORM in Elixir, and it has an API closer to Rails than not, but it does solve the n+1 queries problem in that if you forget to eager load the articles, then this just gives you an error every time. So we could do something similar to Ecto, but if we were to go that route, what my issue with it is, so you'd have like your user struct, right? And I'll have an ID, and let's just give it a name. An article would have an ID, a user ID, a title, and a body. Right, and so what you might imagine is you have something like this. And the problem is, if you wanted to be able to do user.articles, even if we have assumed that they're always equal loaded, what that means is you end up with this. And this bothers me a lot because you very rarely tend to run code where it's something like, if this association is loaded, do stuff with it, otherwise do something else. Like, this is, you always are writing your code assuming it's either there or it's not there. So this is either an unnecessary none that you have to specify when you construct all of these, or it's an unwrap that you're going to just put all over the place. And unwrap means runtime errors, and I really don't like runtime errors, which is why Diesel tries to avoid runtime errors. So I don't like this. So the exact API that I want for associations is still kind of fuzzy to me, but there are a couple of things that I know. First, we'll end up most likely having annotations that look like this. The placement of these actually, and this is the thing that it's not documented because it's not a stable API feature, but that is implemented today, and that does some stuff. It enables joining. Yes, intrusive would probably be a better word than invasive. The placement of these is a little weird because basically everywhere else in Diesel's API, we focus on tables and queries, not on models. And in fact, what this belongs to does is it'll actually generate some code where you could write article belonging to, and then you pass that a reference to a user. And this will return a Diesel query, and so it responds to the full query DSL. And so if you wanted to load it, you'd call .load, and you'd pass that connection. And type inference may or may not be able to figure out what load wants, and there's actually a very real chance that you'd have to then specify that you want an article out of it, because this doesn't carry the type information. This load method is the same method that gets called on any other query in Diesel. So the placement of these is a little weird. Like, this should probably be articles belonging to, articles referencing the module or the table directly. But But the reason I have them on the struct is because we intend for you not to call the table macro directly, right? This is what you could do. And if you were doing this form, then yeah, it would make complete sense for this annotation to go right here. But what most people end up doing is they use the infer schema macro, which calls in that, you know, take the database URL. And that's all well and good, but that means that there's not actually any place for you to hook into the, or to place the annotation on top of the table. So that's why it's on the model, even though everywhere else we sort of focus on queries. Hey Killer Cup, I am sorry for once again streaming in not a great time for Europe, but I'm glad that you could stick around for a little bit at least. So that's the first thing that we sort of know, is that we're probably going to want to have something like this that goes somewhere, even if it's a little funky. The second thing I feel pretty adamantly on is if you have a query that is going to return an article and a user and all of its articles, then the type of that is going to be a tuple of a user and all of its articles. Now, this is where things can get tricky. Because associations can sort of, if you want them to compose, then they can go two directions. And they can go arbitrarily wide, or they can go arbitrarily deep. And what I mean by that is, let's say we have a third structure called comment. I'm not going to give it any fields other than the foreign keys, just to make my point, right? And a comment is unique because it belongs to both a user and an article. This is part of why I have issues with the way that Rails handles this as well. Is it's sort of what's the right way to put this? It leads to ambiguity. So you could say something like, I want a user and then all of its articles and then all of the comments. And it's actually incredibly ambiguous through our current API whether you want the comments that all of the comments left on all of the articles written by that user, or if you want all of the comments written by that user. And that's what I mean when I talk about arbitrarily wide versus arbitrarily deep. So arbitrarily deep would be something like this. You want a user and all of its articles and all of the comments left on articles written by the user. So that would be the types. Oh, not article. That would be comment. That would be the second case. I've not looked at Postgres. Deducing associations based on schema seems fine. I do still want to always have that calling a public API for you, though. So we still need to somewhere determine what the right way to do that is. I guess if it's coming from schema, then having it on the table macro would be fine because the association would get inferred by infer schema. Huh. You know what? That still doesn't allow me to compose them nicely for things like through associations, but that could work. That would solve a lot of my issues with putting it on the model. I will have to explore that more. So this is an arbitrarily deep association, and the arbitrarily wide would say I want a user, and then an arbitrary number of associations, but all are connected at one level deep to the user. So that would be something like a user and all of the articles they've written and all of the comments that they've written. And I don't know, maybe you have a settings table or something, and so all of their settings. Right? So if I want to allow composition on both of these, what I've started to realize as time goes on is that the type signature of that is utter nonsense. I don't know that there would be a great way to represent arbitrarily deep in the same sort of API where we can go arbitrarily wide, especially when we have to deal with single parent and multiple parent. So what I've decided to cut down the scope is we'll go arbitrarily wide but not arbitrarily deep, because there's just not that many cases where you want to go arbitrarily deep through your association tree. And at the end of the day, you may just have to write some code if you need it. And maybe common usage patterns will come out of that. But for now, I want to focus on arbitrarily wide. And so that means that whatever we come up with needs to compose. So I can do user and all of their articles, and then I can also do a user and all of their comments. So I wrote out I sort of spent some time spiking on this. I just wrote out this code, so we created a bunch of users and then a bunch of posts and then a bunch of comments. And I just sort of wrote out like, all right, if I'm gonna just do this manually, what would it require? So the first thing we have are our parent records, and I've got Jim up there so that I'm only working with 2 users. This is still a test case technically. But I'm only working with 2 users. I have this third user, so that way I can have some data that shouldn't come out of this. So that way I can show in my test that I'm actually correctly filtering things. So the first thing we have to do is we have to get all the posts which belong to all of the users. And here I'm using EQAny, the Postgres EQAny, not the EQ_any function, which we're doing in clause, which I only have it called that because in is a keyword. And then there might be a more efficient way to do this, but basically what we want is a vec of post, where the index of that top level vector is the same as the index of a user and contains all of the posts written by that user. So basically, if we want the end result to be a tuple of a user and all of their posts, this is building the thing that we can then pass to zip. So what we do is we grab, what I've done here is I construct a hash map where the key is the ID of the user and the value is the index that user lives. And then we allocate the vector that all of the posts are going to go into. We go and then we basically go and loop through each post, find the vector of posts belonging to the vector of posts for the user that this post belongs to, move it into that vector, zip everything back up, test everything's there, and then we go back and do the exact same thing for comments. And then zipping is a little bit more awkward because we sort of have to zip and unzip it. We're kind of wanting to use tuples as a heterogeneous list here, and then like we're flattening it almost. I'm not sure that this is a thing that needs to make it into the final API right now. The main thing I want to start with is just getting to this point where we have the thing that we can pass as zip. Mainly just because this is already nice and similar looking and I think can be abstracted easily, and we won't have to do things like add weird methods to every tuple to flatten them like this. I'm kind of fine with adding methods to tuples or implementing traits for tuples of arbitrary types if it's for query related things, but this feels so not like something that Diesel should be abstracting over. Yeah. So the end result that I'd like to have here, some sort of method. So like let result, we would probably rename that, but like let result equals, there's sort of 2 steps, right? Because there's actually loading the posts. Let's see. So I'd like to just never have to do that. I'd always just like to be able to work with the user struct. I guess what I'd like to write is let posts equal post. We'll probably still need to specify that. I'm actually going to leave that there. I'm going to just comment out code. and put in what replaces it. And for this, like, I don't know, we'd need to give that some sort of function. Something like that. It's a terrible name, but we can come up with a better name for that later. So this is going to require changes in Diesel, but I think it's pretty straightforward. We have this this trait called belonging to DSL, and we basically just need to write an impl of belonging to DSL for T needs to be vec user, and then so we just need to write like something like that, and then also for borrowed vec user, and then also for slice of user. That's all fine. That's pretty easy to do. It'd be cool if we can do that with like a single blanket impl. I don't know that we'll be able to without specialization, but that's fine. We have a good hook to brute force it. So I'm actually just gonna leave this like so right now, which means I'll need to do that. Because this is just more straightforward, and I think this is the more interesting case right now. So let's take this original implementation, and let's just put it in a function. So this needs to take parents and the children. And we are going to borrow the parents. And ideally, this would just work with any iterator as well. But we'll just deal with slices until we need it to otherwise. Right, so this is our return type. I'm just going to replace users with parents. And then post with, well, posts plural with children. And then post with child. So let's become generic. So what are we doing with parent? We're getting the ID, and that's actually it. So I've been meaning to introduce a trait called identifiable. So that's fine. And then for child, calling user ID. So maybe we'll introduce like a belongs to trait. Yeah. So this is gonna need, because we're using it as the key of a hash map, we'll need this to be hash and EQ. Actually, does hash require, does hash map require EQ, or does it just require partial EQ? where key is EQ. Okay. And then this is actually going to need to take a reference to self and return an owned ID because we're using it as a key in the hash map. So I'm just going to go ahead and put the copy constraint here now so I don't have to write it elsewhere because this effectively already implies copy. And this belongs to a trait. I think we'll just have a foreign key function. So that would mean that this can now change to calling the ID function there. This can change to foreign key. Let's see if that still compiles and runs. I don't remember why I have this pointing at Git or at my path, because it shouldn't need to. Oh well, it'll be fine. It'll help when we're making changes to diesel later. For now, it'll just need to compile diesel once, so this will take a second. Now I did pause for a moment looking at that that vec new line, because I'm pretty sure that's actually going to fail to compile. Well, okay, we can fix some of this first. By parent. What did we call it? We called it group by parent. Oh, group versus grouped. Okay, we need to use hash map and hash. Where was that line? Yeah, so that's what I was slightly worried about. So there's two reasons that was failing to compile. First is because we're not returning anything. That's easy to fix. The second is this won't work because we didn't add the constraint that child influence clone. And so even though we know for a fact that that this is empty and isn't going to clone any elements, just because of how type systems work, it still needs to know that, and because we're not dependently typed, it does need to know that the child influence clone. Now, I've ran into this once before, And one thing that was interesting is, but I wanted to make sure that this was the same performance characteristics. I figured, okay, well, we know vecnu isn't actually allocating anything. So why can we just do, so maybe we're just able to do this. And we'll probably still need, well, we'll see if we need to specify vec there or not. Now, this looks like, oh my gosh, that should be so much less performant, because we know that the previous form is just going to be a memcopy, whereas this is going to be a full loop. But luckily, Rust's compiler and LLVM are really smart, and I isolated the difference between these two down to a really tiny script and compared the generated assembly. And the out-of-memory check happens in a slightly different place, but beyond that, it generates identical code. So that's really cool, and it means we don't have to have the clone constraint. What do you? How do my face and voice not match? Yeah, so we just need to know that we are collecting into a vec here. Oh, and specify that we are returning child. How is that only available in rlib? It's definitely available in dilib. Okay, well, for now, I'm just going to do that so that it will be satisfied. I changed it recently. I removed the plugin equals true and just gave it the allowed crate types, because when you have plugin equals true, it also sets it to prefer dynamic, which causes problems if you are trying to link on something like Windows, where libpq and libsqlite 3 are unlikely to be on any runtime search path. The DLLs are not in places that are normally on your path. Anyway, it's fine. I just won't commit that. I don't know why it was complaining there, but all right. So that works for this case. So if we've done, or maybe not, because it says it's never used. Oh, it's because I didn't put it in CFG test. That's fine. Okay. So we've done our job right. Then I should be able to do group let result equals group by parents. Right. That's easy. Cool. So I guess let's just start to move this upstream. So I almost want to tack it onto here, although it feels wrong to do that. Yeah, let's put in a new module. In theory, there's no reason I should have the hash constraint here. I should put it on the function that's using the hash map, but that's going to end up leaking a lot if I do that, and hash is not an unreasonable constraint to put on a primary key, so I'm going to leave it there. So that's the only import we should need for now. Okay, so we should be able to get rid of the trait here. And do that, and that should still compile. So I tried submitting to R programming to see if I might get some interest over there. I've gotten one upvote. Woo! No love for the live streaming open source on Reddit. All right. No candidates by the name of belongs to. Trait belongs to is not in scope. Did I forget to make it public? I'll bet I did. I'm so looking forward. I'm not looking forward to my move. I'm moving to Canada, by the way, next week, if anybody was not aware of that. I'm not looking forward to moving, but I am looking forward to not having the only source of light in the room be directly behind me. And having, hold on, can I make my camera flip out? Yeah, having like, when I tilt slightly or raise my hand, having the lighting wig out. I have a good desk lamp somewhere, but when we moved into this house, because we were waiting on the visa for Canada, we didn't unpack much of our stuff, and I have no clue where my desk lamp is, so it's either that light source or complete darkness. All right. So we should, in theory, be able to move that up. I really don't like group by parent, though. I almost want to... I almost want to put this as a method on Vec. Like... I can't, though. Can I? No, because it would be vec t where t it would be vec t where t is belongs to. That I don't think I can do that. Wait, of course I can. I control the trait. What am I thinking? Okay, so let's... let's see if Rust is going to make me duplicate the identifiable constraint or not. I think it will. Yeah, I think that reads better. Anybody have ideas for names that don't involve me putting the method on Vec? I'm moving to Ottawa. And I'm guessing from that selection of cities, you also work for Shopify? NWJ Smith? Yeah, I need to duplicate that constraint here. Oops. Need to duplicate it here. Oh, cool. Glad to hear that. I don't know. It's cool. It's cool to see somebody else from the even if it isn't passed from the Shopafolk clan here. Okay, that's fine. Kind of felt like there was an implicit size even there as a super trait, but maybe not. Oh, and it's not going to be, yeah, it's just gonna be that. We're implementing this for Vec. Vec, child. You know, I could almost do this. Because I don't want to do Vec self. That feels weird here, especially if I ever do want to implement this for other iterators, because it wouldn't be a Vec of that iterator. It's always going to be a Vec of child. Yeah, I don't mind putting into iterator as a super trait, actually. That seems fine. And then that. I was originally looking to actually have this get built more into the query builder DSL, but I've started to realize as we go as we do this arbitrarily wide combinations, it's actually significantly better to have it be separate queries. Definitely anything beyond 2, but even if you have just the parent and children, it's arguably better to do them as 2 separate queries, just because the round trip time for the database may not actually be enough to offset the cost of the additional transmission of unnecessary data from the duplicating of the records as a result of the join. Okay, so that we moved that up. Now we can move this implementation of belongs to into CodeGen pretty easily. If you're not familiar with the internals of CodeGen, prepare to be horrified. Because well, I mean, the association stuff isn't too bad, but it can be very hard to digest because we can't import things most of the time, so everything gets fully qualified. And yeah, I don't know. It just tends to be a different class of code because you're dealing with ASTs. Tabarja, I actually do use Racer. I've got it installed. I just haven't gotten used to using it much, and it doesn't tend to work in most of the cases that I want it to. I've only ever managed to make it work for instance methods, and only when I'm calling trait methods from the standard library. And I haven't had time to just go debug it. So we'll do something like this. Put it right after this. So what do we need here? So let's take this. So this will be parent struct name, child struct name. This we don't actually know, but that's okay because we can just write this as parent struct name as. No, we actually do know that. That's going to be that, because it's going to be the same. And then this is just going to be foreign key name. And we've got most of these already here. We don't need child table, we don't need foreign key, we don't need primary key name, we do need foreign key name. And this needs to be qualified. That is a procedural macro Tabarja. And Hockey Buggy. And I guess we did it correct because we're getting a bunch of conflicting implementations. Towarda, I'm actually interested. You mentioned it seems like the feedback was much good, and give us back the AST that it represents. And I guess we did it correct because we're getting a bunch of conflicting implementations. Towarda, I'm actually interested. You mentioned it seems like the feedback was much quicker than full on compiling. What would I have gotten feedback on from Racer? Because to my understanding, it was just something that auto completes. So identifiable is an interesting one. Because, like, the obvious answer is you just do this, right? But it feels like you're always going to put that on queryable. Like, I almost... I shouldn't. I almost just want to have it be whenever you do derive queryable, if your struct has a column called ID or a field called ID, we implement identifiable. Just because you're always going to be implementing those two together. It would make no sense to implement one but not the other. So I kind of want them to just be implemented as a unit. But at the same time, having derive X derive something else feels gross. Let's do this. Let's implement derive identifiable separately, and then we can always just call that for you automatically from derive queryable if we feel the need to. And I can never remember this damn this friggin' signature, so I'm just gonna copy paste that. And we basically always want all those imports. So this becomes derive, identifiable. And we're going to end up calling push annotatable item. Let me something like if let. Got some code here to help parse this stuff. So it's like if let some or some model equals model from annotatable. And I'm not going to do an else clause here just because this function will emit will push errors onto the extension context if errors occur during parsing. And I'm not even going to put this in another function for now. So this is going to be impl diesel identifiable for and this is going to need to handle generics eventually. I'm not going to deal with generics right now. So, struct name is easy. And then ID is going to be, oh, we should actually do primary key name. Which right now just returns ID, but eventually I will properly handle models with primary keys other than ID. And then and what is the method there? Or the field, rather. Tie, of course. Yeah, I doubt that cargo check would actually help us much because the majority of our time is in type checking, not in trans. Might help if I call it, and also if I do anything that involves. Not going to worry about syntax right now. Okay, so I should be able to delete these. Just do that. Not going to worry about syntax right now. Okay, so I should be able to delete these. Just do that. I do really wish, because I'm basically working on adding macros that replaces most of our custom derive with just a standard macro invocation. If you want that, and then the procedural macro will just call the regular macro for you. I do wish there was an option on stable to have custom derive go to a standard stable macro, because most implementations of custom derive don't need anything procedural. Certainly nothing in the standard library does. Well, almost. Basically, if we add... The thing I was working on the Rust compiler earlier today was adding support for lifetime parameters, and then there's also, in the same issue that wants to add the ability to pass lifetimes, is the ability to add... the ability to pass parameter lists, which I'm gonna, once I finish the lifetime thing, I'm gonna open a larger discussion about, because it is ambiguous there whether that means that you want to take anything that maps to the AST's generic struct, which basically means lifetime defs, which is different than just a lifetime because it might also have constraints on it. And what was the unnecessary one? Meta item, okay, don't care about that, don't care about these. As well as the type parameters, which may also have constraints on them, and then also where clause. That's what the generic struct in the AST is. And so if we're gonna take type parameter list is what it was called. I feel like we actually want that to mean generics, and if we want to be able to just take generics, then we should probably be taking each of the individual components allow taking each of those components individually in order for it to be useful. Yes, I know I just put an unwrap up there, but I don't want to change the code. Try to figure out why that didn't actually get called. Anyway, so once we add the ability to deal with lifetimes and generics in macros, in just standard non-procedural macros, most implementations of custom derive don't need anything other than what is available in a stable macro. There's some limitations in the parser that macro rules can use, but it's really not much. So are we not calling this? Is that what's going on here? The other thing that's annoying about custom derive is once you enable it, if you tell it to derive something that doesn't exist, it just silently does nothing. And there's the problem. I have a Y there. I should have had an I there. And that should be an error, but it isn't. All right. So we can get rid of that entirely now. So I need to deal with this. So this is what we want to write. And if we try and compile that right now, we're getting an error that belonging to DSL is not implemented for, well, it's actually because it's only implemented for one type, it's just going to give us that mismatched types. So you know what? This can get ugly and generic, but what I kind of want to write, something like this. Something like this, where we take for anything that can iterate over a reference to T, and T is identifiable, and U belongs to T, we implement belonging to DSL. I don't think I can write this, but let's try it. Identifiable would need to state the table, if that were the case. No, it doesn't. But we need to know our own table. We need to know the table for U. That would get ridiculous. Like, we could write this, but this would be something along the lines of plus identifiable, and then it'd be like u table implements filter DSL for EQ any. Oh, and belongs to would also have to give the foreign column EQ any. The left hand side would be U as belongs to T foreign column or something like that. Maybe we call it foreign key, whatever. That'd be the left hand side, and the right hand side would be any T ID, or actually be as expert vec TID converted to match that column. This would roughly be the where clause if we actually wanted to just make this generic. And we could write this, but I've written where clauses like this before, and I deleted them because regardless of how like much it makes sense when you really think about the type theory and all of that, and sure, that actually would get way cleaner if we had higher kind of types, but regardless of all of that, where clauses like that are what scare away contributors, and I would like I like to keep our code base, other than CodeGen. CodeGen's a scary monster, but the main diesel crate, I try to keep the code base relatively approachable to new contributors. So I avoid adding that. So I think that's fine, but I don't think the average person coming to this code base would think that is fine. So we're going to brute force it. So we'll fix this in a minute. No, you know what? That's fine. Is it gonna be tie? Wait, it's the parent struct name that changes. Oh, the implementation's gonna be different too. Okay, well, if we were to just do it here. So how does this change? So this becomes, let's do it for borrowed vec. We're gonna do it for borrowed vec and borrowed slice. The reason we have to do it for borrowed vec in addition to borrowed slice is because deref coercions don't apply when it's trying to look up stuff for traits. So even though deref coercion should say that if we implement it for borrowed slice, then we should never need to implement it for borrowed vec, it doesn't actually work in this context. So this is no longer find by. So this is going to be like... And these helper types are so much less helpful when I have to actually fully qualify them, but... filter. Basically, this is going to reflect our entire our implementation, unless we wanted to box it. This is the same problem as trying to return an iterator from a function, actually. So the left-hand side is the child table, and the right-hand side is an EQ node. We'll have it be an EQ node. This is going to need to change because we can't do EQ, like equal sign any on SQLite. We'll actually need to use our in node. And I've actually been meaning to make the EQ any function return a node that can either do equals any or in based on the backend it's used with. So I will probably do that as part of all of this. Or just have it do in. I'd rather not have it do in, though, on Postgres. Anyway, left-hand side is the foreign key. And the right-hand side is... oh, and this takes a... This is actually for vec, not borrowed vec, because we borrow in the argument. And then the right-hand side is diesel expression helper types as exper. And this is a little helper type that basically is saying this type, when converted to an expression whose SQL type matches the second argument, which is less complicated than it sounds, but sounds complicated. It's just basically, so it's saying this as expression, and then as expression takes a SQL type. And so that would be this as expression SQL type. That's all it is, but that's really annoying to write, so I've got a little helper type for that. And that's actually what all of these are, all of these helper types. They're basically just the ones in the main helper types module just are the output of calling the method with the same name, and all the ones in expression just convert the second argument to an expression. So that would be the output type. And then the actual impl is I guess we can still just do this primary key name thing. Oh, and this isn't going to be a vec of that. This is going to be a vec of primary key type. We're going to need to use that, I believe. All right. And I think I'm going to pass. I'm going to change this to take this push function. I don't think that worked. Oh, whoops. Well. And the reason these are able to compile in parallels because Diesel CodeGen is just using the released version of Diesel, which is fine because The only place where the DSL dependency is used there is the database connection during infer schema. So it doesn't, but it doesn't actually affect the code that it generates. Ah. Right. Okay, well, this is just gonna get ugly then. The problem is that we're saying convert vec of primary key type to an expression of type integer, but it needs to be an expression of type array integer. So this is gonna be diesel types array. Foreign key as diesel expression SQL type. Very nice and verbose. Flitch 13. No, not that I'm aware of. If you know a way to get the Mac webcam to not adjust the exposure, please let me know. On the other hand, I'm moving in a week and hopefully won't have that light source behind me in my new house. So hopefully it will stop being a problem. Now, why would you care? Why would it be expecting that? Expected struct array found struct integer. Oh, I forgot any. Where would that even be? You're not generally meant to need to reference these types directly, which is why they're in kind of ugly namespaces. Looks like there might be an app that I can use to override the exposure settings on my webcam. I will look at that tonight and try it for the next stream. Why would it not know what post is there? Oh, PG expression any is not in scope. Is it really only under array comparison? Standard any. We like that trait. It is not the any that we need this time. Number of type arguments. Expected 2, found 1. Okay, what does it expect here? SQL type as the second argument, of course. I kind of want to do a helper type here, but for the time being, Now that's a type signature, my friends. Oh man, if I actually inlined all these helpers, this gets nasty. I could always just... oh. This one should not be an array. Anybody in chat play Hearthstone? Did you all see the nerf list that finally came out? Anybody in chat play Hearthstone? Did you all see the nerf list that finally came out? Alright, cool. Yes, I can delete that. So in theory now, this should also work down here. I don't need that IDs anymore. So it's like, at this point, I'm not even sure whether I want to go any further than this or not. Because we could combine these into a single method. But the thing I like about having these be separate, I mean, we'll always have the ability for them to be separate. Oh, let me do the same for oh god, the same for a slice. I can't. Yeah, I can. I mean, it's just like exactly the same, but we changed back to slice. I'm not crazy, right? I do need to implement it for vec as well as slice, because DRF coercions won't work there. I think. I'm gonna double check. Anyway, the thing I like about having them be separate is that it gives you the ability to control scope. So it's very easy. It's very easy for you to the reason we had to do this, if you're not familiar, all type parameters implicitly have a constraint of sized, because otherwise we would need to put that all over the place. And so if you ever want to opt out of it because you want to take, for example, a slice or a borrowed slice, but you need to refer to it at the type level as slice, you just need to put the question mark size there. Anyway, the reason I like that is because it gives you a lot of control. If you ever don't want to load all of the records in an association, you don't have to. It gives you a very explicit place to hook into that before the grouping occurs. So I'm not even sure it's worthwhile, because the signature would get scary, and the other downside to when the signatures get scary is that the error messages get scary. So we could have this function that takes type of parent, type of child, list of parent, and connection. Yeah. So we would either need to have this implementation for both of those, or or for T, where for an arbitrary lifetime, a reference with that lifetime of T implements into iterator, where item is a reference to the parent struct. I don't know. Maybe that's not as, like, that's actually not that bad, but whenever I have to write, like, whenever I'm using for the higher ranked lifetime syntax, just it always makes me laugh. Is that really conflicting? Huh. Okay, well. Oh, right, because I... Wait, no, I deleted the other one. Yeah, it's just conflicting because it can't prove that the other struct doesn't implement it, I think. Anyway, so that's fine. Like, they're literally identical, just other than the type. And I could if I really wanted to, I could move that into a macro, but I really don't want to. Higher ranked lifetime syntax, that's when you put for in the type name. That's saying for an arbitrary lifetime A. Higher ranked types are also a thing. We don't have them, but we do have higher ranked lifetimes in Rust. But it's not where you have to specify the lifetime. It's specifically when you are saying for an arbitrary lifetime. Or rather, you're saying for all lifetimes. Whereas if you were just specifying a lifetime, you would be saying given a lifetime called A, which may or may not be the same as for all A. That belongs to an incompatible type of trait. Really? Yes, it does. Yeah, you probably will never need to use it. It's a very niche thing that only comes up when you're dealing with generic programming. Okay, so what's left? So this actually needs to become this, because I need to bring this down to a single node that either does equals any or in based on whether we're on Postgres or SQLite. And change this to be equals any, like that. So I need to do that. I'm not going to do that right now, though. Is there anything else that would need to be done for this? I don't think so. I mean, tests, of course. Well, basically moving this test into the diesel test suite. That zipping case, do I want to have diesel handle it? So what I actually expect it to look like is, right, so you have the users, up above, and then I kind of expect it to look like you do this. And if you actually need this case, I'd expect you to do something like iter tools, which would give you zip 3. So then you could do users into iter zip 3. This is roughly what I expect it to look like, and then user would look like assuming that this is for all users. Something like this. So I don't know. I mean, yes, it is definitely more verbose than that. But I don't mind it. This is what the equivalent would look like in Rails. But I really don't mind this that much. Like, I can see the flexibility, where the flexibility is there, and we can probably find a way to make this a little bit less verbose. But I think this is a good place to start. I think this is a good place for it to be for 0.7. That way I can go kind of mess with it in my apps and see if it suits the needs there. Especially crates.io is one of the big ones that I want to make sure that it fills the needs there, because that tends to be one of the more complex cases. Flitch, yes, I do agree with you that when you get to a reasonably big code base, you will need to create pretty generic code. Most people aren't going to work on those kinds of code bases. And even if they're working at companies that have those kinds of code bases, I don't think most people will necessarily work on the generic code specifically. But you are correct in that the needs of large apps tend to mirror the needs of library authors. So, does anybody have opinions on this API? I think it's in a decent place to poke it, and maybe build one more layer on top of this. So yeah, it's getting pretty. We've been going for almost 2 hours. I do need to get dinner at some point, so I think this will be the place to cut off the stream for tonight. Does anybody have any last questions, comments, concerns, feedback? Anybody want to tell me why the code is terrible? As always, I will be tweeting the link to the final pull request when I finish it up. The only thing left to do before the pull request on this is make EAQ-NE be something that works on both SQLite and Postgres. Which I will actually just do that as a separate pull request from this entirely, and I will probably open that up tonight and then come back to this and update it. Yeah, so if you don't want to tell me my code is terrible now, you can always comment on the pull request and tell me my code is terrible there. If you have feedback on the stream, please let me know. I'm at sgriff on Twitter. That's the easiest way to get a hold of me. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and I will see you next time. Oh, got a quick question before I log off, actually. How am I targeting Rust versions given their release cadence? Basically, I don't know what the oldest version of Rust that we work on is. We generally roughly only target the latest version of Rust, since Rust, it tends to be so stable. That just isn't a big deal for us. But yeah, we test on latest stable, latest beta, and not latest nightly, but reasonably recent nightly that I bump periodically. Right now, I think we work on anything up to 1.6, but I'm going to be making a change soon that makes it so that we only work on the most recent version and the one immediately prior to that, so that our integration with the new time types in the standard library is just there by default. Once we hit 1.0 in Diesel, I will probably be stricter about what supporting older versions of Rust. Anyway, that's how we target Rust release stuff. Cool. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I will see